So this is the start of the 1942 scenario. As you may notice, the Japanese have used the one Chinese division they subtracted in order to bring back to full strength this 14th Army so that they can subsequently resume their conquest of Philippines. I remind you that in order to gain control of Philippines, at the end of the offensives phase, when we conduct the US political will segment, both of Davao and Manila have to be under Japanese control. So let's notice a bunch of things. Right now, there is General MacArthur here with a reduced garrison which is doomed to fall sooner or later. But they've got one full-strength ground unit and a reduced air unit. This air unit is the sole reason they are in supply. So if you destroy this one, which is fairly easy if you bring some 40 factors of strength. So if, for example, you activate Yamamoto to bring 1 and possibly 2 steps with extended range and use these 2 air forces, this is a guaranteed hit even on a 1/4 air naval result. So this one will be eliminated. And in this case, MacArthur is not in supply anymore as a headquarters because there is unneutralized ZOI all around him. And the only port he can use is this one. So he's officially out of supply. What does this mean? You can of course try to bring your ground units and destroy him, but it would be even easier to not waste an activation here and just wait for the end of turn segment where they will be suffering attrition. So at the end of turn, this one will suffer attrition, and later on in turn 3, it will be far easier to bring your ground units here and complete the conquest of Philippines by eliminating this one, and then MacArthur will have to be relocated to the turn track. And historically, he went down to the South Pacific and orchestrated the reconquest of New Guinea, and through South Pacific, he eventually returned and reconquered Philippines, but that's another story. Anyway, this is about Philippines. You control this resource hex, and all American units here are eliminated, the ground units, I mean, and all the naval and air US units that are here have to conduct emergency movement to leave Philippines, which I remind is 10 hexes away for naval units, and the normal or extended range for the air units. And also this port of Jolo belongs to Philippines, so it's these islands plus Jolo. And as previously noted, this one long-range bomber is out of supply because there is unneutralized ZOE over him. This one cannot neutralize the enemy ZOE, so this one is unneutralized, and because it is unneutralized, this one is out of supply, and so it cannot be moved further. And that's enough with Philippines. Let's move to the other countries. As noted previously, if you control Kuantan and Singapore at the end of turn, Malaya surrenders. And Malaya also includes all this part denoted by these kind of borders. And there is no additional effect when you conquer Malaya. This one headquarters lives forever because it cannot be repositioned. And you also gain control of this important resource hex. And the most efficient way to do this is again destroying this Air Force, because if you notice closely, this is the only reason that the Malaya headquarters is in supply. So if you bring 1 or possibly 2 Air Forces and target this one, you need 18 points to destroy it, and with a total of 36, chances are that you will destroy it, eliminate it, or at least reduce it and later on eliminate it. And now Malaya headquarters is out of supply, and if things don't change, this one will suffer attrition at the end of the turn, and it will be much easier for you to conquer Kuantan and Singapore with your ground units in turn 3, for example. So both Malaya and Philippines result in one political will down for the Americans. And then we've got Dutch East Indies. That's a bit trickier because you have to take control of all these resource hexes. So since the Japanese want resources, and since all this is resource hexes for the Dutch East Indies, you can guess where history is going. The Japanese wanted to conquer all these beautiful resources, and they did so in 1942. And let's see for ourselves how we can do this. There's a bunch of unoccupied ones like this one, but at the start of the 1942 scenario, the Allies can do an emergency naval move for all their naval units. So usually they bring some naval units here to protect these ports, which are the entrances to Java. And they usually play the Arcadia Conference event, which places this special joint headquarters. This is a headquarters that is only placed by the event, Arcadia Conference. And this ABDA-COM stands for American, British, Dutch, Australian Command. So it is placed in any of these four islands in supply eligible ports. So most usual place is this one, Shilasap, if I am pronouncing it correctly, because it has got a sufficient garrison to protect it for a little while. Another popular place of entry is Kendari, for example, or maybe Balikpapan or Tarakan, but for the most part you will be placing it into Shilashap. And let's see how the Japanese can control it. First of all, let's not forget to mention that there's a bunch of useful events for that, which is the paratrooper events, Western Force, Central Force, and Eastern Force, which indicate that if a hex is within a Japanese air unit's normal or extended range, and it is either unoccupied or protected just by a Dutch regiment, then you can eliminate the Dutch regiment and immediately place a control markers. So this is an easy way of securing some resource hexes. But other than that, you can either amphibiously assault with a unit here. The allies cannot react because this is not an important location so that they can create a battle hex. They cannot create a battle hex via special reaction, and then you can move by ground. Or you can directly amphibiously assault these hexes. They are just occupied by the Dutch regiment. And the thing is, you've got a -2 modifier for mixed hexes like Tarakan and a -1 die roll modifier for Balikpapan. And since what you want to achieve is a 1 times result to destroy the regiments and not a half times result, you have to score at least a 3 after all the modifications. So if you bring just one carrier, this provides both the +2 modifier for air unit or carrier present and the +2 for naval units present, because the opponent will most likely have nothing to answer with. So with the +4 and the -1, you are guaranteed to achieve this 3 die roll result, which means a 1 times result. So you will be able to eliminate the Dutch regiments. And with cheap tricks like that, you can secure some easily grabbed resources, because if you don't, the later the game goes, the harder it will be for the Japanese. And when it comes to Soerabaja, and if I'm not mistaken, the name in Indonesian is Surabaya, but we are European Westerners, so we will be pronouncing it like Soerabaja, just like proper Spaniards. And this is garrisoned by this naval unit. So in this case, in order to amphibiously assault it, you have to be stacked with a naval unit. So a valid move would be this one, for example, to use this one guy to amphibiously assault here, escorted by Ryujo or even Nachi together. And they should end their movement in this hex. And in this case, if you win the air-naval combat, which you will most likely do because there is not a whole lot of strong naval units for the allies early on, then you can complete the amphibious assault because you will be the only one with ground units here. And this is the key to neutralizing the ABDA headquarters. So as previously mentioned, it is pretty possible to neutralize the Southwest Pacific headquarters of General MacArthur and the Malayan headquarters. And this one is a bit trickier, the ABDA headquarters. But if you amphibiously assault Soerabaja, then this only leaves them with 2 possible ports for supply, which is Shilashap and Batavia. And even if you just assault here, then they cannot use this port because they cannot trace their supply line through here, through land. So this just leaves them with these 2 ports. And again, this is the only one unit that provides a zone of influence for them. So if you bring some sufficient force to strike it and destroy it, then they have no zone of influence over them. And if you just amphibiously assault the hex like this one and place your control marker here, Then you can post-battle move one carrier air unit here. And now you have zone of influence from Teluk Betung to Batavi and Shilashap. And this means that all of these ports are not able to provide supply to the Abda headquarters because there is zone of influence all over them. And this is checkmate for the Abda headquarters. So by efficiently using a small number of activations, you can neutralize these headquarters, which means this one unit, for example, will be reduced due to attrition at the end of turn 2. So for the most part, you want to use your activations to destroy the units that provide the zone of influence for the allies during turn 2. And this will result in massive casualties due to supply for the allies. And after that, in turn 3, you can complete the conquest of the historical Japanese objectives relatively easily. And one other thing that this does is that the allies are then limited in where to place their replacements, because if all these hexes are out of supply, then they cannot possibly place their reinforcements here in order to save the Dutch East Indies. So these are also doomed to fall if you play efficiently as the Japanese early on. Now, these are the easy ones, and let's move to the other kind of objectives for the Japanese. And let's not forget that when Dutch East Indies fall, it is -1 political will for the Allies, and all the Dutch units are eliminated and removed from the map, and the Japanese gain control of all ports and airfields all around Dutch East Indies, which extends up to here, Timor and Amboina, for example, and the island of Celebes. So all these hexes change control, and unless there are American or Commonwealth ground units there to garrison them, otherwise all these hexes revert to Japanese control, and all US air and naval units there have to conduct emergency movement to leave the hexes for somewhere else. Now, moving past these historical objectives, let's move to the kind of harder stuff. We've got Marshall Islands, which include all these hexes, which are within 2 hexes from Kwajalein and Eniwetok. These are the 2 ports that belong to the Marshall Islands, and also we've got all these airfields. So, at the end of the turn, if somebody controls both Eniwetok and Kwajalein, then all the Marshall Islands hexes revert to their control. So, initially the Japanese are in control of those, but if the Allies manage to land to Eniwetok, for example, and then conquer Kwajalein, which they will most likely be able to do during the mid-game, then they gain control of all these hexes. But there is no political will loss for that. Now, moving down to the Solomon Islands, whoever is in control of Rabaul and the Guadalcanal at the end of the turn gains control of all Solomon Islands, which is these ones, these ports and airfields, and also this one, Admiralty Islands. So this is pretty important because later on in the game there will be a bunch of air units here and there, and if, for example, the Allies are something like this and the Japanese have conquered these ones, then there usually will be zone of influence over all these hexes, and this means that the Allies cannot place their allies here because these are controlled by the Japanese, and then if a battle occurs here, then these ones cannot reach here and help them, and vice versa. If the Japanese attack here, these ones cannot use their range to reach here. So it is pretty important to control the Solomon Islands early on. But again, there is no political will loss for controlling the Solomon Islands, and usually the Allies want to reconquer it during the mid-game to expand their grab from South Pacific to New Guinea and then Philippines. Speaking of New Guinea, there is one resource hex here, which, as you may guess, is pretty important for the Japanese for their card draws. And whoever gets control of the resource hex plus all the ports of New Guinea, which is Biak, Hollandia, Wewak, Lae, Gili Gili and Port Moresby, gains control of all named locations of New Guinea, which means the rest of the airfields. No political will reduction for conquering New Guinea, but again it is a strategically important location because it isolates Australia and possibly the Solomons, and it can pose a problem for Australia later. So the hardest one hex to conquer for the Japanese is Port Moresby, of course, which is, I remind, the only one mountain hex that can be amphibiously assaulted, but again there is a -3 die roll modifier when attacking Port Moresby. So the safest way to do it is when it is lightly garrisoned by this guy, who will suffer attrition at the end of the turn because there is no headquarters to support him. Normally there won't be a headquarters that can provide supply to him, so he will be reduced due to attrition, and this is an intended mechanic of the game, which represents the initial confusion of the Allies during 1942 and the lack of command. So the key to that is probably strategically moving some strong guy here, so after conducting an amphibious invasion and gaining control of Malaya, then if it is your controlled port, you can bring some very strong unit by strategic movement, and then you can ground move him to conquer Port Moresby. And if you also conquer Gili Gili and the rest of the easily up for grabs ports, then you can control the whole of New Guinea. And after that, let's move to the first big one, guy, which is Australia. How can you conquer Australia? It is arguably the hardest thing to achieve as the Japanese player. It requires control of all these ports and airfields of Australia. And if you manage to do this, it is -2 political will for the Americans. And they also will be drawing one card less for the remainder of the game every turn. And notice that the Allies can reconquer every nation. For example, they can reconquer Philippines by recapturing Davao and Manila, or Malaya by recapturing Kuantan and Singapore. And they can do so with Australia as well if they gain control of all ports and airfields again. But even if they do, they cannot undo the effect of the one less card drawn every turn. They will just regain their political will, as they do when reconquering a nation. I mentioned that it is really hard because most of these places are out of reach of the Japanese headquarters in terms of supply, so some zones of influence here can make your task really harder, and usually the Allies will have a bunch of units like this in Townsville and in Darwin, and all their later to arrive headquarters will be placed here, and they can all use these units very efficiently, but it might be possible with the use of some particular events that allow the relocation of headquarters here. So let's make a brief pause to talk about relocation of headquarters. As you may recall, you may play a card to conduct an offensive, either as an event card or as an offensive card. We have covered the rules about this, so I'm not gonna be repeating them by now. But what you can also do is play a card for its event. Of course, there are many useful events like War in Europe or Inter-Service Rivalry, to mention just a few. And there is one particular event that allows you to relocate the combined fleet headquarters along with a bunch of naval units into a port that is 3 hexes away from a resource hex, so you can move it here, for example, along with a bunch of naval units. And in this way, you can reach all your possible targets for the future. And if you do this in turn 2, maybe before the Allies can even react, you can take control of the most crucial ports like Townsville or Cairns or Darwin. And then it only leaves Windham, Derby and Broome, plus the easily grabbable airfields. So maybe you can conquer Australia early if you use this event. But let's talk about the other options you have with your cards, besides playing offensives or events. One thing you can do is voluntarily withdraw your headquarters. You can use a card of any value to take a headquarters from wherever it is and place it on the game turn track. And in this way, this will be returning as a reinforcements during the next game turn's reinforcement segment, and it cannot be delayed, as mentioned previously. You can do so with a card of any value. And when returning, you can place it in any friendly controlled port where it is in supply. But what you can also do by playing a card of any value is repositioning it early for an early game return during the turn. So if you have used a card to move it to the game track, you can use another card to bring it back. Or even if the opponent has involuntarily repositioned your headquarters by gaining control of its hex, so it has to be moved to the game turn track, you can use a card of any value to bring it back to the game during your turn. And this concludes your card use. You only play this card without conducting any offensive or event, just to bring back the headquarters. Where can you bring it? Well, if it is an early HQ return during the turn, you can only bring it in Japanese home islands if you are the Japanese. And if you are the allies, you can bring it prematurely only into Australia or Hawaii or India. So you are limited when you bring it back early, but if you're bringing it back as reinforcements, you can bring it in any valid destination. So for example, if the Japanese have gained control of this port of Biak, and if the combined fleet has been moved to the game turn track by using a card of any value, even your most useless one, a 1 OP card, then during the reinforcement segment, you can bring it back here, for example. And in this way, you can command many units with your 3 efficiency rating and reach further than you normally would with your range. So you can use these units to possibly complete the conquest of Australia, which would be a really big accomplishment. When Australia surrenders, no Australian units can enter the game as reinforcements for the remainder of the game. And if they are eliminated, they cannot return to the game as replacements. However, if they are still on the map, they may receive replacements and they do not have to leave the game until eliminated.